Today I'll be ripping into the throttle body on my 5.7 liter TBI motor here on my 95 Suburban. We're going to be tearing it down, rebuilding it, and installing some brand new ACDelco injectors. First order of business is to simply remove this air filter housing. We got the bottom here coming off. Next, after this vacuum line is removed, we just lift up on this collar. And this gives us a really good view of the throttle body itself. You can see the throttle body down here, and up here we have our injector pod. We have two injectors right here, and the fuel pressure regulator right back here. We're gonna be removing all of this and rebuilding all of it. To accomplish this rebuild, I bought some new parts from ACDelco. Inside this box is the TBI rebuild kit, and inside these boxes are two brand new injectors. Here's one of the injectors, and you can see just how big this thing is, and that's because it serves half of the engine. Here you can see the injector spray pattern before. This is obviously the old injectors. And what I can see with my eye is this injector on the driver's side seems like it's dripping just a little bit. I do see it spraying, but I also see drips. And on this passenger side, I'm seeing more of the same. I do see some spraying, but I also see a few drips here and there. Now, I'm not sure if this is abnormal or absolutely normal. I guess we'll see when we put the new injectors on. Looking under the hood, we can see I have a fuse block here. The directions for the TBI rebuild kit say to pull the fuse or relay for the fuel pump, let the truck run until it starves of fuel. By doing this, I'll be relieving all the pressure and excess fuel in the fuel supply line leading to the back of the throttle body. According to my map here, this right here is my fuel pump relay, so I'll be pulling this one. Now I can start the truck and let it run till it dies. Which may be never. That may actually be it. It never actually restarted and ran. I don't know, maybe I should have pulled the relay while it was running. I guess we'll see when I take those out. Now I'm going to disconnect the negative side of the battery. Negative side of the battery is now removed. Now I'm just going to work my way from the top down. I'll remove these plugs, remove the harness from the TBI. Next, I'm actually going to start by attempting to remove just this injector pod. I want to try this because perhaps I can avoid removing the entire throttle body itself and just remove this injector pod and rebuild it and put in new injectors and bolt this thing back on. I'm not sure if that's possible because of the fuel lines in the back, so here goes nothing. So far, it looks like we have 3 Torx bolts. It's a T25 here, one here, and one on the other side there. They're easy to loosen. Looking straight down at the injector pod here, you can see I removed those 3 bolts. There's one here, and one right back there. Now, I can move this. It is loose. However, just like I suspected, these fuel lines are attached to here. So much for me trying to cut a few corners. Looks like we're doing a full rebuild. I'm going to have to pull these fuel lines off and all of the sensors off, including the vacuum lines, and pull the entire thing off, which is what I wanted to do in the first place. But the more I looked at it, the more I was hoping I didn't have to. Oh well, we'll do it right. Now I'll just remove all of the vacuum lines and sensors. Here's a vacuum line here. And that goes to the PCV valve right there. There's another smaller vacuum line right next to it. We have one more vacuum line here. And it looks like we have another vacuum line located at the back. I disconnected my IAC valve and the TPS, just the electronics. We're going to try to leave those sensors there. Now I'm going to remove the throttle cable and the kickdown cable. I now have every single thing disconnected except for the 2 fuel lines. I've got this 5/8 line wrench, and I'll back it up with this 3/4 inch wrench. I do know that fuel will obviously drip out of this connection once I loosen it. I don't know if fuel is going to spray. So I do have some eye protection on, and I'm going to get started here. Okay, it wasn't that bad. Go ahead and loosen it, hopefully the rest of the way by hand. Okay, so when I pull this line out, I do see fuel coming out, so I'm going to grab a rag to stick under there. I know that's loose, so let's work on the other side. Both fuel line fittings are removed using the same wrenches. The only thing left to do is to remove the 3 bolts for the throttle body assembly itself. This right here is one. You can see another there, and the other is right here. That was very, very easy to break free. This one as well. And the other one as well. With those bolts removed, yep, this whole throttle body assembly is completely loose and ready to come out. Fuel lines, there we go. And I do have to say that was extremely easy. And here's the inside of these throttle body ports, and surprisingly, they are extremely clean. Okay, with the entire throttle body assembly here on the bench, this area right here would be towards the firewall, and this area right here towards the front of the car. You can see my two fuel line fittings back here. I'm not able to remove the injector pod unless I remove these fittings. I'll use the same 3/4 inch box wrench, and I'm trying to be careful here. I know that I have some sensors here. Yep, got that one. I know there's a little gasket on the end of these things. Yep, you can see the gasket. Okay, looking at this injector pod, you can see one of the fittings is still in here, and that is because I couldn't take it off. And during that time of trying, I was able to figure out that I could just slide this thing out. Now that I took one side off, this whole injector pod just slid out from the throttle body unit itself. And thinking about this again, I probably could have cut a few corners and not removed the entire throttle body assembly if I just removed these two fuel fittings from this injector pod. I would have then been able to remove this entire injector pod, thereby leaving the throttle body system on the intake manifold. Not to worry though, it wasn't a big deal. 3 bolts and I was able to get this out. Here's the bottom of the throttle body assembly, and I was able to remove this gasket fairly easily in one piece. Although I do think this gasket was still functioning just fine. You can see these areas on the gasket where the fuel was starting to eat away at it, so I am glad that I took this whole thing off and am replacing all of these gaskets. Other than that, looking inside, it is fairly clean. So I'm just gonna clean up this surface here. For the new gasket, I'll take off these little tiny pieces of old gasket. That way everything will seat nice and flush with this new gasket here included in the kit. The next order of business is to tear down this entire injector pod assembly. That way I can replace both the fuel injectors, all the O-rings, and the gaskets. Okay, I do have an extra piece of cardboard here where I drew out a crude drawing of this. That way I can put my screws and bolts into each of the corresponding locations, just in case they're all different lengths and whatnot. Those are easy, 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 very easy, easy. All right. Okay, every one of these was on there, not really tight whatsoever. So I'll just have to remember that when putting this all back together. So there's one of the bolts with the lock washers, and I'll go ahead and put it in its corresponding hole, and I'll do the same for the rest. I have all 8 of those torx screws taken out. This thing should come apart, but it probably needs a bit of persuasion. I was finally able to detach the top cover plate from the bottom there, and that was actually really hard to do. The gasket just didn't want to let go. What I ended up doing was using a small screwdriver right here and just digging it in there and just prying. It was the only way I can figure out how to get this thing off. I did see it start to go, so I kept at it, and eventually it did give way. I will have to clean this edge up though, but luckily it's just the very edge of that, so the gasket should cover that no problem whatsoever. You can see I now have access to these injectors, which I can just pop out and pop the new ones in. But before that, we have some work to do. I have to clean up these gaskets, and I also have to remove this fuel pressure regulator so I can replace this gasket. For this fuel pressure regulator, the torx size is T15. I'm taking out 2 screws that are opposite each other and leaving these 2 in because there is a pretty stout spring under here. So what I'm seeing here is a weld basically to keep you from being able to adjust. There's a set screw in there, probably to adjust the fuel pressure, but they put a weld here so you cannot access that after it's been adjusted. I'm putting some very positive pressure on this thing as I remove these 2 screws here, because I can feel that spring wanting to jump out, and I don't want to let that happen. Okay, so there's one. Yeah, that's a strong spring. Got all the screws out. Here we go. Wow, look how long that spring is. Okay, That's it, guys. Nothing to it. Pretty simple stuff when you break it all down. And you can see that set screw there. It basically just adjusts the pressure on the spring. So I'll set this off to the side just like this so I can put it together exactly the way it was. And looking at this here, all right. I'm trying to pay attention to how this thing sat from the factory, and there is a difference. You can see there are guides there, and there also is this flat piece here, and there's a flat part of the gasket here. It must not really matter as long as you line up those locator tabs. This new gasket seems like it's the same all the way around, so maybe it doesn't matter if it's this way or, you know, this way, but it's good to pay attention to the way things are so you can always put them back together the correct way. So we'll remove this, and that's it. I'm going to rub this down with ultra-fine Scotch-Brite pad just to try to make sure the mating surfaces are nice and clean. Not too rough, not too hard here. Well, so far, I can tell you right now, this gasket right here is the hardest gasket to remove. I'm using this scraper tool very, very slightly to just scrape off as much of the gasket as I can. I did put some WD-40 on here to try to soften the gasket up, but it doesn't seem to be working. So I'm just going extremely slow. I don't want to score the metal. I'm just trying to ever so slightly get this thing off of here, and then I'll follow it up with some ultra-fine Scotch-Brite just to clean that up. After that, I'll have the same process on this half. It's been a long time, and this is pretty much as good as I've been able to get this gasket mating surface here. This is very, very difficult stuff. I've been using this little razor blade scraper to ever so gingerly get the little pieces of gasket off of there. And then I've been using this 3M ultrafine sanding pad, and it's just going ever so slow. So I'm hoping that this is good enough. I mean, we do have a gasket that sits on here, and it does get sandwiched. So hopefully that gasket will be able to take up and make up the space that we have, you know, little bits of remaining gasket here. The reason why I don't want to sit here and jab at it with my razor blade scraper is because I'm going to keep gouging away at the metal here, and I feel like that would be an even worse situation. So this is nice and sanded with that sanding pad, and I think this should be good enough. Next, I'm going to get these old injectors out, and I still have more scraping to do on this part of the gasket. That gasket literally couldn't have come off in a worse way. So I have gasket on both surfaces that I have to get off. With these injectors, there's a little lip right under here, and you can use something like this pencil here and that lip to just pry up and be able to pull these injectors out just like that. Once you have that injector loose, you can simply pull it straight out. There's also a rubber O-ring, and you can see the inside of that injector pod is very clean. And here we go with the other injector. And I'll be pulling these out and setting them aside to save if I ever need another injector. And you can see now I have to work on removing these little bits of gasket around the surfaces here, which is very tedious work. Yeah, this is going to take some time. After about an hour of fighting with this thing, I've gotten the surfaces to look pretty good. They are definitely not perfect, but I'm just hoping that that new gasket will make up the difference, and I think it will. Okay, so I have the gasket in place as well as this spring and cap. They do give these extra long screws in the kit, and I do believe this is to locate this hat here and be able to kind of drive it down evenly with that spring so that we're not collapsing this gasket. Okay, I have the two posts there installed, and I'm just going to cinch them down evenly just to try to get this hat down there without collapsing this gasket. That's the hardest part here. Okay, with this cinched down evenly, I think I can... Yes, okay, so those... You don't necessarily have to screw these posts down all the way. You just need to get it on there and the posts act as a guide so that you can evenly press it down and get some of these regular screws started. I haven't cinched these screws down all the way yet. I'm going to remove these guide posts. And now with those posts removed, I can replace the original Torx screws. I snugged all 4 of these down, remembering that they weren't very tight from the factory. Included in the kit, we have these 2 metal washers. If you look right here in this injection pot, the washer basically just sits on that shelf. And then your O-ring would sit basically right on top of that. I am going to get some super lube and lube up these O-rings. I believe lubing up these O-rings is key to having these injectors go in nice and easy. Also included are these 2 smaller O-rings that go on the ends of the injectors themselves. These injectors already have this screen or filter pre-fit because these are brand new. And so I'm just going to lube up these O-rings and slide them right underneath that filter. Okay, with our first injector, I'm going to slide this O-ring on. I'm assuming it goes something like that. I'm doing the same with the second injector, just sliding the O-ring all the way up against the screen. Okay, so looking inside this injector pod, you can see the shelf down there that smaller O-ring sits on. So it should seat right there. I'm going to place the top O-ring here. Hopefully it'll just fit right in here. Yep, just like that. Placing the second O-ring, and they both fit in there pretty good. Grabbing one of these injectors, you can see this little nipple sticking out there. And looking inside, again, there is a little notch there that this nipple sits in. So I'll just go ahead and slide this thing in. Okay, yep, that just pushed right in. Felt nice and solid. We will go ahead and slide this one in there and press down. There we go. There was an audible click that I heard when I pushed these both in, so make sure you're listening for that if you're doing the same thing. And this is what the bottom looks like. This is how far they should be sticking out. Next, I'll place this gasket, which I have quite a few of them because each one of these injectors came with one, and my rebuild kit obviously came with one. Interestingly, again, 2 of those were actually bent. This one is, as you can see, it is also deformed, but it didn't have any creases in it like the other 2. So I'm using the best of the 3 that I have. All right, just like that, I was able to sandwich everything together. Now I'm going to throw the Torx screws back in. And of course I have the original screws mapped out so I can put them back in their exact locations. And of course, putting this thing back together, I forgot one gasket, which goes right here. It is this little guy, but luckily I can just slide it into place. Yep, and sandwich it all down. I can put the original screw back into its original slot. I'm just tightening everything back down by hand. Number 1, this allows me to make sure I'm not cross-threading and forcing anything. But number 2, I'm able to make sure that I'm not over-torquing anything. I'm going to go across all of these Torx screws evenly just to make sure they're all snug. And then I'll come back with my ratchet and give them probably, I don't know, 1/8 of a turn or so. These things were not very tight whatsoever when I took them off. Okay, that seems to be good there. All right, just giving it a little snug. And the thing with this is you're going to have to go through and retorque each one. As you go and torque certain screws, other ones become loose. So you don't want to over tighten it, but you just want to make sure that there's not a loose one in there. Okay, all the screws are nice and snug. On the end of this fuel fitting here, you'll see this little nylon gasket. My kit does include a new one, so I'll be taking this one off and replacing it. Grabbing a pair of needle nose here. There we go. There's the old gasket. And with this new one here, you just simply press it on just like that. I didn't remove this other side. I literally could not get it out, so I'm just going to leave it. And making sure everything is absolutely seated correctly, I can go ahead with my T25 Torx bit and tighten everything down. Okay, we have this gasket here that I matched up. There's 2 that comes in the kit, and I just chose the one, obviously, that looked like the one that was on there. Okay, I did pull everything back off again, and that's because on these fuel lines you can see there are some O-rings, and the kit does come with new O-rings. So I'm going to replace these O-rings and then put the throttle body back together. Okay, hopefully you can see this gasket that came off. It's the smaller of the two off the fuel lines, and it's actually in very terrible shape. So I'm glad that I remembered to pull this back off and replace these O-rings. Here's the new one that came in the kit. It's green, and I'm taking off the other O-ring here. Of course, you got to be careful not to drop anything inside of the intake. Here's the other O-ring, and both of these do need to be replaced. Here's the new one. Okay, so everything is back together, cinched down the best I could do. I'm going to give it a start. We're going to look at the spray pattern and also inspect just to make sure I don't have any fuel leaks or anything like that. Hopefully this thing starts on the first crank. I do have to reconnect the battery and also put the fuel relay back in. Okay, looks like we have a nice spray pattern. As nice as I can tell anyway. Truck started on first crank, which is good. I don't see any fuel leaking down here or back here. All right, guys, well, as far as I can tell, these injectors are working beautifully. I don't know if they're any different than what I took out, but I do know that the ones that I took out were 25 years old. So it couldn't hurt just to replace them. Now I have 2 extras should I ever need them. But the real test is going to be to take it out on a test drive. Well, that's done. I'm really glad I did that. It's something I've been wanting to do for a really long time now. I know it's a somewhat common maintenance thing on these TBI engines, and that rebuild gasket kit from ACDelco was very cheap. And on top of that, I know I probably didn't have to, but with the injectors being 25 years old, I figured if I'm going to be tearing into this thing, now is as good a time as any to just replace those injectors with brand new ACDelco injectors. And that's what I did. From the looks of it, it looked like the original injectors were dripping just a little bit, and I didn't see that with the new ones. And as you can probably tell, it is now the next day. I worked on that TBI rebuild all day yesterday, and the hardest part for me was getting that old gasket material off enough with the razor blade and then the Scotch-Brite pad, trying to make sure that the gasket mating surfaces were nice and clean. I wasn't even able to get them perfect, but I'm not going to spend 24 straight hours grinding and sanding old gasket off of that. But so far, everything seems to be working out just fine. It doesn't seem like there's any leaks or anything like that. I don't have any fuel leaks with the fuel lines, so everything seems to have worked out just fine. So here's something really interesting. Last night, after I completed all the work, I wasn't expecting, to have 20 horsepower gain from this. Nothing like that. What I was hoping was just that my truck would run better. And what I found was it is. My throttle response in particular is much better. I'm noticing that the moment I press my gas pedal, I'm feeling the power come in. Whereas before it almost seemed like, not like it was delayed or anything like that, but it just had a little less power. Now that was just the first test drive last night, and I know there's a pretty strong placebo effect that we're fighting with whenever we do work like this on our vehicles. So I'm keeping that in mind when I'm trying to convey the differences, if there are any, between the old throttle body injection with the old injectors and the new rebuild with the new injectors. So now that I've had a chance to drive it last night, I can compare that with what it feels like today. So hopefully I can give you an accurate representation of what something like this would feel like if you were thinking about doing the same thing to your rig. So let's go ahead and see how this thing starts up. Pretty normal starting, same amount of time it normally took to start, same thing just now. Idling nice and smooth. Of course, I did just recently replace the idle air control valve and the O2 sensor, and it was idling very smooth after those 2 replacements. Yeah, everything seems normal. So far, so good. All right, idling here at a stoplight seems very smooth. Here we go. I would have to say for sure there is a much better throttle response than there was before. Yeah, my initial impressions right now match what I was feeling last night after all the work when I took it out for the first time. It seems that I'm having a little more, let's call it torque. The throttle response just feels a little more instant and almost better. So I'm assuming that maybe I have a little more torque there. I don't know, maybe the spray pattern is better on the injectors. I'm just making this stuff up as I go. But it seems that, you know, as I press the pedal, I'm feeling the response. Whereas before, not that I wouldn't, but it just didn't feel like I would feel as much response. Right now, yeah, slightly, but definitely feels like I have more torque, I think. I'm thinking that's what the feeling is. Okay guys, we have this really long hill here that's pretty steep. I'm about 50% on my gas pedal here, and we're just gonna see how this thing wraps out and what it sounds like and feels like. Just shifted. Felt good. All right. I can tell you guys this much. There is definitely a difference in my throttle response. I just got done driving this thing all around, through the neighborhoods, up some steep hills, back onto the freeway. I had a chance to gas it a few times. I can tell you right now, the difference I'm feeling is in the power band and the throttle response. I'm assuming that can only mean a little more torque. Now, the difference isn't like night and day. It's not earth-shattering difference. It's just that I can tell a difference between what it was before and now. It's not like I would say that it would be worth it to spend all that money for this little bit of difference, unless you just wanted to change it out, rebuild your throttle body just because it's extremely old. Maybe your injectors aren't really performing. You can see the spray pattern isn't really great. And maybe that's an opportunity to do what I just did. I did it on mine because, well, my setup was 25 years old. It was original. And I could see that the injectors, although they were working fine, I could see the spray pattern wasn't quite great. I could see there was a little drips here and there, and I thought, you know, hey, that could be improved upon. Why not throw some brand new injectors in there? Why not rebuild the throttle body injection? That way I never have to worry about it again, really, for the life of this truck. I mean, if the first set lasted 25 years, I can't imagine this setup I just did not lasting another 20 years plus. So hopefully that's the case. Anyways, if you've watched this video till now, please do me a favor and hit that thumbs up, and also comment below if you have any suggestions for me, corrections, you see anything I did wrong, let me know. Also, if by chance you've seen me forget a few steps, maybe forget a part here and there, don't worry, I got to it. I got it all done. Everything is put back together exactly the way it came out, and it's running great. So I guess that'll do it for this video. I rebuilt the entire throttle body injection system, added 2 brand new injectors on top of that, and I didn't break anything. That was the biggest thing for me, is not making it worse than it was to begin with. And so far, everything seems not only perfect, but better. Well, for One Road, I'm Jimmy, and I will see you in the next one.